Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling one of those documents that can feel almost impenetrable, the kind that really sets the stage for everything that comes next. Trade, defense, global engagement.
And our mission, as always, is to cut through that bureaucratic fog.
Exactly. Get you straight to the core of what's actually being said.
And the document today is, well, it's a monumental one. We're looking at the brand new 2025 National Security Strategy of the United States. It just came out in November.
And right away you get the sense this isn't just another policy paper.
Oh, not at all. I mean, its authors frame it as this foundational document.
Yeah.
They're positioning it as a complete and total philosophical break from the kind of strategic thinking that's really dominated Washington for, the last 30-plus years? Since the Cold War ended?
Okay, so let's unpack that because, we've seen these strategies come and go. A lot of times they can feel like, I don't know, a political manifesto or just a wish list someone wrote down.
Right.
But this one, this NSS, it challenges that idea from the very first page. So before we even get into the policy, the what, we have to talk about how this document defines strategy itself, because that definition really is the lens for everything else.
It is, and what's fascinating, what's really striking, is just how restrictive that definition is. I mean, the document basically argues that most past strategies failed precisely because they weren't, in a technical sense, strategies at all.
They're just lists of goals.
Lists of goals, exactly. Laundry lists, they call them. This NSS, it demands a concrete, realistic plan, something that shows the essential connection between the ends. And by that, they mean the desired, achievable outcomes and the means.
The actual tools you have at your disposal.
The tools, the resources, the assets the nation actually has or can realistically create. So if you want something, you have to prove you can pay for it, you can resource it, and you can apply some kind of measurable tool to actually get it done.
It's not just a collection of noble ideas, then.
Not at all. A true strategy, according to this, has to rigorously evaluate, sort, and prioritize. It comes right out and says that not every worthy cause, not every nation, not every international issue could be a focus. The core mission, the sole focus, is the protection of core national interests. Full stop.
Nothing more, nothing less.
That narrow focus is the engine.
Which, okay, that brings us to the critique. The document calls it a necessary welcome correction. And to really get why the strategy looks so different, we have to understand the failure it claims to be fixing. So what exactly does it say went wrong for the last few decades?
We absolutely have to spend time here because that critique is the justification for everything that follows. I mean, it identifies several big interconnected errors in American strategy since basically 1991. You can sort of categorize them into philosophical overreach, economic miscalculation, and allied dependency.
Okay, let's start with that first one, the philosophical overreach. It's surprisingly harsh on the foreign policy establishment itself.
It's remarkably blunt. It really is. It claims that after the Soviet Union collapsed, American foreign policy elites kind of indulged in this hubris, convincing themselves that, and this is a quote, permanent American domination of the entire world was not just possible, but actually desirable.
Wow.
And this, the NSS argues, was a massive failure of strategic imagination, of realism. It led the U.S. to shoulder what they call forever global burdens.
Things like nation building, policing conflicts all over the globe.
Exactly. Burdens that the American people, as the document puts it, neither understood nor consented to bear.
And at the same time, this global overreach was happening alongside a financial model back home that just wasn't sustainable, right?
That's the financial angle, yes. The NSS says the U.S. was trying to do two massive things at once. Fund a huge domestic welfare and regulatory state and a massive global military and diplomatic machine. And that dual mission just proved to be, financially and spiritually exhausting for the country.
Then we get to the economic critique. And this is aimed squarely at trade policy.
Oh, yes. The document puts the blame for the hollowing out of the American middle class and the industrial base, which they define as the engine of national power. It puts that blame on what it calls misguided and destructive bets on globalism and so-called free trade.
So the idea that prioritizing, efficient global supply chains over the health of your own country was the core mistake.
That's it in a nutshell. They claim those policies prioritize cheap stuff over the structural integrity of the nation itself. So you got economic vulnerability and global overreach as two sides of the same coin.
You outsourced your wealth and you overspent your resources abroad.
Precisely. And the third major criticism is the alliance structure. The document just comes out and says the U.S. let wealthy allies offload the cost of their defense, We basically acted as a global security guard while our allies focus on building out their social safety nets.
And that pulled the U.S. into fights that were, what, peripheral or irrelevant to our actual interests.
That's the phrase they use. And finally, there's this concern about tying our hands to international institutions. They call it transnationalism. The strategy says the U.S. let its policy become too dependent on these bodies, many of which, it argues, are driven by either outright anti-American sentiment or this desire to just dissolve national sovereignty altogether.
Ceding control over our own destiny.
Yep.
The implication is really clear. The elites chased an impossible dream permanent domination, and in the process, they weakened the very thing that made America powerful in the first place, its internal character and strength. That sets the stage perfectly.
Let's jump into part one.
Yeah.
What this strategy says America actually wants, the desired ends. And it starts with the basics, but man, it quickly expands into some very domestic, even cultural territory. So the core national goals laid out here, they're not just about, tanks and missile defenses. They start with the traditional stuff. Sure, continued survival and safety of the United States as an independent sovereign republic. But then the definition of what constitutes a threat just expands immediately. If you look at this list of domestic wants, they really are the bedrock for the entire strategy. It explicitly says that a threat isn't just a military action. For example, they talk about protecting the nation, not just from attack, but from hostile foreign influence.
And they list things like espionage, predatory trade, and cultural subversion.
Right.
Let's pause on that one. Cultural subversion. That's not a phrase you typically see in a national security document. What do you think they're implying with that?
Well, the document doesn't give you like a dictionary definition, but it frames it as any foreign influence that tries to undermine the nation's capacity for self-governance or its self-confidence. This could be anything from foreign manipulation of social media and news to influencing educational systems or just, stoking internal political division.
So the logic is that a self-doubting, fractured country is strategically weak.
And easily manipulated. It's a powerful idea. The internal division itself is a national security vulnerability that our adversaries are actively exploiting.
Moving back to control, the document is extremely specific about borders.
Oh, absolutely. The goals demand full control over our borders, over our immigration system. And it stresses this need for a global environment where sovereign countries work together to stop rather than facilitate destabilizing population flows. It's just an unwavering statement of the right to determine who comes in.
And on the hardware side, they're very clear. Next-generation missile defenses. They even give it a name. A golden dome for the American homeland.
Yeah, and that signals a massive non-negotiable tech push. The idea behind the Golden Dome is this layered missile defense system that can neutralize anything. Hypersonics, ICBMs, you name it. The goal is to make sure no adversary can ever hold American cities or military assets at risk.
Which they see as critical to maintaining freedom of action abroad.
Exactly. If you can't be threatened at home, you have more options overseas.
The economic goals are just as ambitious. It's not just about having the world's strongest economy. It's explicitly about the need for the world's most robust industrial base, a base that can meet demands in both peacetime and wartime.
And the emphasis there is on output, on resilience. The strategy insists that building this base, ensuring our manufacturing capacity is bigger than any rivals, has to become the highest priority of national economic policy.
It's the structural correction to those destructive bets on globalism they were talking about earlier.
It's a complete return to prioritizing capacity over just, low cost.
And this industrial push is supposed to be fueled by energy dominance.
Correct. The goal is the world's most robust, productive, and innovative energy sector. And they frame energy as more than just fuel for the economy. It's one of America's top strategic assets, a pillar of geopolitical power.
Okay, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. When the NSS talks about the final, almost philosophical goal, restoring American spiritual and cultural health, this is highly unusual for a formal security document.
Well, it connects directly back to that cultural subversion idea we talked about. The NSS states, point blank, that long-term security is impossible without this restoration. They link security to cultural health by outlining what they want to see inside the country. An America that cherishes its past glories, a people who are proud and optimistic, a gainfully employed citizenry.
And the emphasis on family structure is explicit.
It is. The document says this cultural health cannot be accomplished without growing numbers of strong traditional families that raise healthy children. So the NSS is treating stable families and cultural cohesion as primary national security assets. The argument is that the nation's long-term human capital, its ability to produce competent, engaged citizens, depends on them.
So if you connect all the dots, the administration is basically saying that internal character competence, spiritual health, industrial strength is the foundation for any power you project outside your borders.
It is the ultimate expression of America first. The core vulnerability isn't necessarily a missile from an adversary. It's a loss of will, purpose, or capability driven by your own domestic decline.
Okay, now let's turn to the core foreign policy interests, the 5 pillars that the U.S. must focus on above all others. This is the highly prioritized to-do list for the rest of the world.
And this list really demonstrates the geographic and functional recalibration of American attention.
Pillar 1, the Western Hemisphere.
This is a firm reassertion of regional dominance. I mean, the goal is simple: assert and enforce what they're calling a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
That's a powerful historical reference.
It is. The original Monroe Doctrine warned European powers to stay out. This corollary expands the definition of a threat to include mass migration, transnational criminal organizations, the cartels, and any hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets. It specifically calls out China and Russia.
A Trump corollary is a name that immediately signals a much more assertive, close-to-home posture. Okay, Pillar 2 is the Indo-Pacific.
The focus here is overwhelmingly economic and navigational, stopping economic damage from foreign actors, keeping sea lanes free and open, preserving secure supply chains, and maintaining access to critical materials. The document says the primary mission in Asia is winning the economic future while maintaining military deterrence.
Pillar 3, Europe. This is framed as supporting allies, but there's a surprising internal focus to it.
Right. They want to support allies in preserving freedom, but the explicit goal is restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity, which, aligns directly with those domestic cultural goals we just covered. It implies the U.S. sees internal decline in Europe as a strategic vulnerability for the entire alliance.
Pillar 4, the Middle East. The big takeaway seems to be avoiding forever wars.
Correct. The core interest has been simplified dramatically. It's about preventing an adversarial power, mainly Iran or resurgent Russian and Chinese influence, from dominating the region and its critical choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz. But crucially, the NSS says that avoiding the kind of overextension we saw for decades is now a core interest in and of itself.
And finally, Pillar 5, technology, which sort of cuts across all the other regions.
This is all about setting the standards. They want to make sure U.S. tech and U.S. standards, especially in AI, biotech, quantum computing, drive global development. And preserving American intellectual property is seen as integral to maintaining both economic and military superiority. They're framing the tech race as the new great power competition.
So we have the desired ends. The document then briefly touches on the U.S.'s available means, the assets that make all this possible. What are the big advantages the NSS lists?
Well, it's an inventory of American structural advantages that most countries can only dream of. First is the still nimble political system that can course correct, which seems optimistic. Then there's the massive economy, the financial system anchored by the dollar, the most powerful military, and of course enviable geography, separated from great powers by oceans.
But they also immediately link those structural advantages to the administration's ongoing domestic agenda, right? They turn policy efforts into strategic assets.
This is the really clever part of the structure. It integrates specific, sometimes controversial domestic policies directly into the list of strategic assets. Things like rooting out DEI to reinstill a culture of competence, unleashing energy production, reindustrializing the economy, tax cuts, deregulation. They're essentially saying that these domestic reforms are the means of effective foreign policy.
It's a perfect feedback loop. The America First strategy has to be pursued both at home and abroad at the same time because success in one depends on success in the other. All right, let's move on to the philosophy guiding all of this. The NSS describes its ideology as, and I'm quoting here, pragmatic without being pragmatist, realistic without being realist, principled without being idealistic.
I mean, it's trying very hard to define itself outside the usual DC foreign policy boxes.
It's a deliberate attempt to signal that this strategy isn't, beholden to any academic or political dogma. It states very clearly that its motivation is singular. What works for America? Or, in 2 words, America first.
Which means flexibility.
Yeah.
Transactional relationships over rigid ideological commitments.
That's the idea, and one of the central pillars, a phrase we've heard a lot, is the principle of peace through strength. So how does this NSS actually define that deterrence model?
It seems pretty straightforward. Well, it lays out this clear, almost circular causal chain. Strength, and that means economic, cultural, and military power, is the prerequisite for deterrence. If your adversaries are deterred by your power, they won't threaten your interests. But it goes a step further. Strength doesn't just deter, it actually enables peace.
How so?
The NSS argues that parties who respect American strength are often more willing to negotiate. They're more receptive to U.S. efforts to resolve conflicts because they're actively trying to avoid testing that strength.
So the U.S. needs overwhelming strength not just to win wars, but to avoid them in the first place.
That is the core logic.
Mm.
And that leads directly to the next principle, which is this predisposition to non-interventionism. This is a very deliberate philosophical anchor, and they cite the founders.
Right, it connects back to the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all nations have a separate and equal station. The NSS affirms that, suggesting the U.S. should treat other nations as equals and respect their national interests.
Which means you have to set a very high bar for what justifies an intervention. The document admits that, rigid adherence to non-interventionism isn't really possible for a global power, but the default position, the starting point, has to be avoiding intervention unless a core U.S. interest is directly threatened.
Like one of those 5 pillars we just talked about.
Exactly.
And this philosophy, according to the NSS, has led to some extraordinary rapid results. This brings us to the section on the President of Peace legacy. And this is probably the most dramatic claim in the whole document.
It is a stunning assertion of diplomatic success. The document claims that by successfully marshaling American strength and deal-making ability, the administration secured unprecedented peace in 8 conflicts throughout the world over the course of just 8 months of the second term.
8 conflicts in 8 months. That is a blistering pace. Does the document offer any specifics on how this happened? Why this unconventional diplomacy supposedly worked where others failed?
It provides some context. It argues the success was due to a combination of that unconventional diplomacy, the explicit threat of military might, and the surgical application of overwhelming economic leverage. They describe the method as using these tools to surgically extinguish embers of division.
So basically, forcing a resolution by making the cost of continuing the fight much higher than the benefits.
That's the implication.
Let's list those specific examples because the sheer diversity of them is really noteworthy.
It is. The NSS claims successful negotiations brought peace between Cambodia and Thailand, the long-running Balkan dispute between Kosovo and Serbia, the intense conflict in Africa involving the DRC and Rwanda, the decades-old tensions between Pakistan and India, and then there's the normalization between Israel and Iran, which is a massive geopolitical claim.
Massive claim.
And then the Nile River dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia and the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Caucasus.
And it also explicitly mentions ending the war in Gaza.
Yes. The strategy claims success in ending that war with all living hostages returned to their families, stating that the U.S. leveraged its regional relationships and the threat of decisive action to bring about a conclusion. The NSS basically holds up this entire list as proof that the peace through strength model works.
Okay, let's pivot now to the core principles that are driving the policy. You picked out 2 critical ones to explore. The first one is the primacy of nations and sovereignty.
This one is absolutely foundational to the whole America First idea. The NSS is unequivocal. The world's fundamental political unit is and will remain the nation-state. And it sees it as natural and just that all nations put their interests first and guard their sovereignty.
Which basically gives every other nation permission to act selfishly, just as the U.S. intends to.
That's right. And the document takes a clear stand against what it sees as threats to that sovereignty, criticizing the global push towards transnationalism. It says the U.S. will stand against sovereignty-sapping incursions of the most intrusive transnational organizations. The goal is necessarily to leave these institutions, but to aggressively reform them so they serve national interests.
But the NSS also spends a lot of time defining what protecting American sovereignty means internally, and it goes way beyond just military defense.
This is the crucial domestic-facing side of the principle. It says protecting U.S. sovereignty includes preventing foreign powers from censoring American discourse or free speech through tech or financial pressure. It also explicitly calls out lobbying and influence operations that try to drag the U.S. into foreign conflicts.
And then there's the most politically charged part of this discussion, the manipulation of the immigration system.
Absolutely. The NSS warns against the cynical manipulation of our immigration system to build up voting blocs loyal to foreign interests within our country. The strategy frames any attempt to change the political or electoral outcomes of the U.S., through organized migration as a hostile act against American sovereignty.
So this principle is a powerful declaration that the U.S. will chart its own course, free of outside interference, on matters of internal governance and demography.
Exactly.
Okay, the second critical principle you highlighted is competence and merit versus global talent. This links directly back to that domestic cultural health goal.
Right. Competence and merit are explicitly called among our greatest civilizational advantages. The strategy argues that complex modern systems, from infrastructure to the military to financial markets, can only function when the most competent people are in charge. The warning is existential. Where the best Americans are hired and promoted, innovation and prosperity follow.
And this is where the policy directly wades into internal political fights, but it frames them through a national security lens.
The NSS states that systematically destroying or discouraging competence would cause complex systems to fail, rendering America undefendable. It warns against radical ideologies that seek to replace competence and merit with what they call favored group status. The document is framing the internal debate over meritocracy as a national security issue. If you can't select the best people, you can't defend yourself.
But there's a really important caveat here, a warning against using meritocracy as a loophole to hurt American workers.
This is the nuance that protects the America First, worker-centric economic policy. The strategy states, we cannot allow meritocracy to be used as a justification to open America's labor market to the world in the name of finding global talent that undercuts American workers.
So it's a closed loop. A healthy, sovereign, competent, and economically strong America is the prerequisite for effective foreign policy. And foreign policy must, in turn, reinforce those domestic qualities. It's a highly integrated, almost defensive view of the world.
Which leads us straight into the strategic priorities.
It really does. And the NSS doesn't mince words, starting with priority number 1, the end of mass migration. The document just declares the era of mass migration is over.
It's placed first in that section for a reason. It's treated as the most fundamental defense of sovereignty. The strategy is blunt, stating that who a country admits into its borders, in what numbers and from where, will inevitably define the future of that nation. And controlling that is defined as both a right and duty.
And what's the justification for this position?
Well, the document argues that the collective experience of the West over the last few decades proves that mass migration has strained resources, increased crime, weakened social cohesion, distorted labor markets, and undermined national security. So it concludes that border security has to be treated as the primary element of national security.
Okay, so then priority 2 addresses the financial relationship with allies, burden sharing and burden shifting. This is the end of the U.S. propping up the entire world order like Atlas.
This is a massive structural shift, and it's driven by that principle of reciprocity. The NSS says that wealthy, sophisticated allies have to assume primary responsibility for their own regions and contribute far more to collective defense. The U.S. is moving from being the global security guarantor to being more of a convener and supporter of targeted partnerships.
And this section introduces a very specific quantitative global standard. We need to really understand the significance of this, the Hague Commitment.
This is maybe the single biggest economic demand in the whole strategy. The Hague Commitment is defined as a new global standard pledging NATO countries to spend 5% of GDP on defense.
Wait, 5%? The old standard was 2%, and most countries couldn't even meet that. 5% is huge.
It's astronomical. It demands a total strategic and economic overhaul from basically every NATO ally. It means they'd have to double or even triple their current defense budgets. It implies a fundamental reordering of their national priorities, shifting massive amounts of money away from domestic spending and towards military capacity.
And the NSS claims allies have endorsed this and now must meet it.
The implication is clear. U.S. military commitment will be contingent on allies taking on these responsibilities. The strategy says the U.S. will offer more favorable treatment, better commercial access, tech sharing, priority on defense contracts, but only to those who step up and take primary responsibility for their own security.
It creates an incentive-based system tied to a very high-stakes commitment.
The very high-stakes commitment. And this clarity, the NSS argues, will let the U.S. avoid overextension and focus its resources where they're really needed.
Finally, we get to priority 3, economic security. The NSS treats this as foundational, outlining this multi-pronged approach to strategic reindustrialization.
The first piece of that is balanced trade. The U.S. will prioritize rebalancing trade, reducing deficits, and using tariffs strategically to stop things like dumping and other anti-competitive practices. The goal is fair, reciprocal trade deals, but the document makes it clear that American workers and industries come first, even if that means higher costs for consumers in the short term.
And that feeds right into reindustrialization and reshoring, the idea that the future belongs to makers.
Right. The strategy calls for the U.S. to reindustrialize and reshore production, using tariffs and new tech to attract investment and raise living standards for workers. The goal is explicitly stated: never again reliant on any adversary, present or potential, for critical products or components.
It's almost like a 21st century version of Alexander Hamilton's argument that national independence requires self-sufficiency.
That's a good way to put it. And that brings us to reviving the defense industrial base, where the NSS points to a huge gap that's been shown in recent conflicts. They talk about this cost-exchange ratio gap.
Can you break that down? What does that mean in simple terms?
It refers to the unsustainable math of modern warfare. It means we're often spending $1 million to shoot down a $1,000 drone, or using multi-million-dollar missiles to take out cheap systems. That math just doesn't work in a long conflict.
It's financially unsustainable.
Completely. So the strategy calls for a national mobilization to innovate powerful but low-cost defenses
Well,
and to produce modern systems and munitions at scale, quickly, to fix that fundamental imbalance.
military strength depends on industrial strength. There's that loop again.
Exactly. And the final piece of this industrial strategy is energy dominance, which is declared a top strategic priority.
This is a massive policy shift. It's a direct repudiation of years of policy focus.
It is absolute. The NSS emphasizes restoring dominance across oil, gas, coal, and nuclear. Cheap and abundant energy is seen as the necessary, non-negotiable fuel for reindustrialization and for maintaining the advantage in things like AI, which require just incredible amounts of power.
And the NSS contains an explicit political rejection of previous policies, framed again through that national security lens.
Yes, it states, "We reject the disastrous climate change and net zero ideologies that have so greatly harmed Europe, threaten the United States, and subsidize our adversaries." The argument is that these ideologies prioritize abstract goals over national strategic power, which results in vulnerability and dependence on foreign, sometimes hostile energy sources.
The final piece of the economic puzzle is preserving America's financial dominance, keeping the dollar as the global reserve currency.
This is critical leverage. The NSS says this status has to be preserved by leveraging our free market system and aggressively pursuing leadership in digital finance and innovation. This financial dominance gives policymakers huge leverage globally, and the NSS makes it clear that this power, the ability to use sanctions or control capital flows, is a strategic tool that can't be taken for granted.
It really is a complete economic reversal, from relying on global supply chains and climate goals to a focus on tariffs, self-sufficiency, and energy exports, all justified as national security.
Okay, so let's shift now to how these principles and priorities actually translate into regional policy. Starting close to home in the Western Hemisphere with that Trump corollary. The NSS asserts American preeminence here as a condition of security.
Right, and the strategy is focused on a policy of enlist and expand. This means enlisting reliable partners in the regional champions to help control migrations, stop drug flows, and nearshore manufacturing. It's about ensuring stability right on our doorstep.
But the means of enforcement detailed here are, well, they're quite aggressive. It seems to require a military realignment. It requires a four-point adjustment, a readjustment of our global presence away from theaters that are less important now, and towards urgent threats in our hemisphere. This includes using the Coast Guard and Navy to control sea lanes, but crucially, it specifies targeted deployments to secure the border and defeat cartels, including, where necessary, the use of lethal force to replace the failed law enforcement-only strategy.
Wow, that is a significant operational shift. Moving from a law enforcement-only approach to potentially using lethal force and targeted ops against criminal organizations.
It signals that the strategy sees the cartels not just as criminals, but as non-state actors, posing a direct existential threat to the nation by flooding it with fentanyl and trafficking humans. And in the expand part, the U.S. is pushing to be the region's partner of choice for resources and infrastructure.
But how will the U.S. counter foreign inroads? The NSS admits that competitors have made major advances, often through low-cost assistance.
The strategy details using U.S. financial and tech leverage to expose the hidden costs of that foreign assistance, specifically naming things like espionage, cybersecurity risks, and the debt traps that are imposed by adversarial powers. The U.S. goal is for our agreements and alliances to be contingent on them winding down that outside influence.
So getting rid of foreign control of military installations, ports, key infrastructure.
Exactly. And the document emphasizes that American goods and services have to be made a far better buy in the long run. It even instructs that where the U.S. has leverage, agreements must include sole source contracts for American companies while simultaneously pushing out foreign companies.
Okay, moving to Asia, the goal is clear. Win the economic future, prevent military confrontation. And the NSS starts with a correction of China policy, stating that the old assumption that opening our markets would make China behave was fundamentally mistaken.
The NSS says China got rich and powerful and used that wealth to its own advantage, completely outside the rules-based order, and that American elites were either willing enablers or just in denial. The Indo-Pacific is still the key economic battleground. It's almost half the world's GDP.
And the NSS provides some fascinating data on how China has adapted to the tariffs that started back in 2017. This really points to the new battleground for global influence.
This data is critical. China's direct exports to the U.S. fell from 4% of its GDP in 2017 to just over 2% by 2025. But China has pivoted. Its exports to low-income countries doubled between 2020 and 2024, and those exports are now nearly 4 times its exports to the United States.
Wow, so the economic battleground has totally shifted. It's not about direct U.S. trade deficits anymore. It's about competition for influence in markets in the developing world.
Exactly. The NSS recognizes this is where most of the world's economic growth will be. The American strategy is to consolidate its alliance system, the U.S., Japan, Korea, Australia, into a cohesive economic bloc that commands over half the world economy to counteract these predatory practices globally.
And in terms of military deterrence, the focus is tightly wound around the first island chain.
The priority is deterring a conflict over Taiwan, not just because of semiconductors, but because of its critical location, giving access to the second island chain. The U.S. commits to deny any aggression anywhere in that first island chain. It's a very clear line in the sand.
And the core concern with the South China Sea.
The NSS says the main worry is a hostile power imposing a toll system, or just arbitrarily closing the sea lanes that carry a third of all global shipping. Preventing that economic strangulation is a top strategic interest.
And this strategy requires major increases in defense spending and access from our allies in the region.
Oh yes, the NSS presses Japan and South Korea to drastically increase their defense spending. And it demands that our first island chain allies grant the U.S. military greater access to their ports and facilities to reinforce our ability to deny any attempt to seize Taiwan.
All right, now to Europe. Promoting European greatness. The NSS offers a surprisingly bleak assessment of Europe's problems, and it goes way beyond just military spending.
It really does. The NSS asserts that Europe's economic decline, its share of global GDP, is down from 25% in 1990 to just 14% today, is actually eclipsed by what it calls the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure.
Civilizational erasure, that is extremely strong language for a policy document.
It is, and it lists several deep interconnected issues to justify that term. The European Union undermining sovereignty, migration policies creating internal strife, widespread censorship, and, critically, cratering birth rates and a loss of national identity and self-confidence. They frame it as a collective loss of will.
And the NSS suggests that if these trends continue, it's an open question whether some NATO members will even be reliable allies in 20 years.
That's the strategic risk. A NATO member that undergoes a severe demographic or cultural transformation may stop viewing its alliance with the U.S. and its Western traditions the same way. It's a very frank, almost demographic assessment of long-term alliance viability.
And that leads to the specific context of the Ukraine war. The U.S. goal is an expeditious cessation of hostilities. The NSS argues the war has had the perverse effect of actually increasing Europe's external dependencies.
Yeah, the NSS cites the example of German chemical companies building massive plants in China using Russian gas they can't get at home. It's an illustration of how the conflict is damaging Europe's strategic autonomy and industrial base, which runs completely counter to the goal of having strong allies who can stand on their own.
So what is the U.S. goal in Europe, given this dire assessment?
The goal is to cultivate resistance to the current trajectory. The U.S. wants to encourage patriotic parties, enable Europe to stand on its own feet economically and militarily, and prevent NATO from being this perpetually expanding alliance that always relies on the U.S. to step in.
Let's shift to the Middle East. Shift burdens, build peace. The NSS argues that the reasons the Middle East dominated U.S. foreign policy for so long just don't hold anymore.
It identifies two key changes. First, U.S. energy supplies are diversified. We're a net energy exporter, which reduces the strategic need to constantly police the region for our own energy security. Second, superpower competition has given way to what it calls great power jockeying, where the U.S. still has the best strategic and economic position.
Conflict is still there, but the NSS claims specific strategic victories have greatly weakened Iran.
This is a major assertion. The NSS claims Iran has been greatly weakened by Israeli actions and by a specific U.S. operation. President Trump's Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025, which it credits with significantly degrading Iran's nuclear program and removing a major long-term threat.
So the future focus is entirely different. It's about shifting the region from a source of conflict to a place for partnership and investment.
Exactly. The NSS sees the Middle East emerging as a major destination for investment in things beyond oil and gas nuclear energy, AI, defense tech. And this shift is predicated on accepting leaders as they are. The document cautions against the misguided experiment of hectoring nations, especially Gulf monarchies, into abandoning their traditions. Stability, it argues, is more important than imposed liberalization.
Core interests remain, securing the Strait of Hormuz, protecting Israel, expanding the Abraham Accords. But the days of the Middle East dominating U.S. foreign policy are over.
And the strategy ties us back to that President of Peace legacy, arguing that fostering peace and normalization allows the U.S. to finally prioritize its interests in the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific.
Finally, Africa. The NSS calls for a major transition from an aid-focused paradigm to one based on trade and investment.
The strategic shift is away from providing liberal ideology or just humanitarian aid and toward fostering mutually beneficial trade relationships, harnessing Africa's natural resources and economic potential.
What are the specific areas of engagement and investment?
Well, the NSS lists negotiating settlements to ongoing conflicts, like DRC, Rwanda, and Sudan, and preventing new ones. On the investment side, the focus is on critical mineral development and energy using U.S.-backed nuclear energy and LNG technologies to generate profits for U.S. businesses and secure critical resources.
It sounds like Africa is viewed almost exclusively through the lens of economic competition and resource security.
That is the clear strategic interpretation. The U.S. must remain wary of resurgent terrorist activity while avoiding any long-term American presence or commitments. The goal is transactional engagement that benefits the U.S. economically and strategically, ensuring U.S. and allied businesses, not foreign adversaries, dominate access to those strategic materials.
This has been an incredibly extensive deep dive into a document that really is a blueprint for a massive strategic realignment. I mean, the breadth of its claims, from the Hague Commitment to the Golden Dome to the Trump corollary, it makes it one of the most consequential NSS documents we've seen in decades.
If we synthesize the key takeaways, the overarching philosophy is rooted in this aggressive and very narrowly defined national interest. This NSS demands reciprocity and burden sharing from allies, and that's exemplified by that Hague commitment of 5% GDP defense spending.
And it fundamentally elevates domestic economic and cultural health reindustrialization, meritocracy, border control, energy dominance. It puts all of that on the same level as core national security priorities.
And militarily, there's that clear shift in focus, paying much closer attention to the Western Hemisphere, enforcing that Trump corollary with lethal force against cartels, and bolstering deterrence in the first island chain while pulling back from the Middle East.
The document views all that conflict resolution we talked about as a necessary tool to free up U.S. resources for these core areas.
And ultimately, this document treats the internal character of the U.S., its culture, its competence, its meritocracy, not just as a domestic issue, but as a prerequisite for long-term security and power abroad. It suggests that for this administration, securing the homeland culturally and economically is the first and most vital line of defense. It comes before and enables everything else. The vulnerability isn't external, it's internal.
And structural self-sufficiency is the ultimate goal. The strategy says the U.S. must never be dependent on any outside power for core components, for labor, or for energy. It's a deliberate, aggressive effort to reverse 50 years of globalist policy.
You connect it all together, the entire NSS is based on the premise that integration has made the U.S. strategically vulnerable. And the solution it outlines is this radical push towards self-sufficiency and purely transactional engagement.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Given the extreme emphasis on reshoring industry, using tariffs to restrict market access, and asserting energy dominance while explicitly rejecting climate change ideologies, is the vision outlined in this NSS essentially aiming to make the U.S. not just secure, but structurally self-sufficient? And if so, what are the inevitable global costs and consequences for development, for the climate, and for global institutional stability of the world's lone superpower choosing isolation over deep integration?
That decision will certainly define the next generation of global politics. Food for thought, indeed.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll be back soon with another stack of sources.